Well,
Thank
your
you.
research is very impressive, and we are very glad to have this chance to discuss with you on it. This is Professor Zhang Shen from Department of Medical Oncology, Fudan University Cancer Hospital. And he has some queries about your study today. If everything is ready, we can start this discussion now. And please mute your phones and keep yourself seen in the camera, since we need to record this interview.
Yes, very good.
Dr. Neal, thank you very much for accepting this interview. Actually, I think first, congratulations on your successful study of HERO. I think it's a tremendous well study which has a very big impact on the treatment of prostate cancer. So I have some questions for you, so we can discuss something in detail about this study. So before the oral Relugolix, the drug which you have tested in the HERO study, another LHRH antagonist which has been used a long time ago, Dagrelix, has not been widely accepted in the field for the treatment of prostate cancer. So what's your opinion? Or what do you think about the two drugs of LHRH antagonists? Well, what's your opinion? Can you share?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very important question, Professor. I was involved with the development of really all of the depot formulations of LHRH therapies starting back in the late 1990s. The 3, the 4, the 6-month formulations of the different Leuprorelin therapeutics, the different companies, which I thought was a certain convenience advantage as opposed to the initial daily, then monthly. And as you know, the LHRH is a category of androgen deprivation therapy are effective, but they're not effective until 2 to 3 weeks into delivery of the drug. In fact, it's a counterintuitive mechanism of action. So that if you and I were divided into a competition back in the early 80s, and you were team A and I was team B, and you had to come up with a product that was an antagonist versus an agonist, the team that came up with the antagonist would clearly beat and would be considered superior to the agonist. I mean, what would be the point? Well, what happened was that the molecular formulation was not achievable. It was too large of a volume of delivery of chemical, and for much more detailed scientific reasons, was not achievable, and also created subsequently some volume controls, PK and PD issues. So the agonists became the standard of care in the early 1980s. And it wasn't until the mid-2000s, literally 25, 30 years later, that Dagrelix and other companies were working on an antagonist formulation. And it was ultimately achieved. So the challenge with the antagonist Dagrelix at the time and other formulations, for example, Aberelix, was that it had to be given Dagrelix monthly, and it also was given not intramuscularly, but rather in what's described as a deep subcutaneous administration. The deep subcutaneous administration has caused, at least in most studies, about a 30% pretty significant injection site reaction. And so if 1 out of 3 patients find it very uncomfortable to receive the drug on a monthly basis, the convenience and the administration and the dosing schedule hampered the adoption of Dagrelix, despite the fact that it really has, for all practical purposes, a superior mechanism of action. It's the mechanism of action that, you know, as I said in my example, we would have wanted in the early 1980s, but it wasn't achievable. And if you then add to the practical aspect that urologists and medical oncologists become, to some degree, creatures of habit, and they develop relationships with products and with companies. Sometimes it's just a comfortable relationship of process within a clinic. And then, you know, honestly, sometimes there are economic considerations as well, and they vary by country to country. So I think those are all the reasons why it has been very difficult for Degarelix to get a greater percentage of market share. And in addition to that, and I apologize for being a bit long-winded with my first answer, but in addition to that, there has always been a notion that, okay, yes, the initial antagonist versus agonist is better, but in the long run, it won't make that much of a difference except for patients who have large volume disease and get a clinical flare. And in the long run, the surge, the counterintuitive supraphysiologic testosterone surge is irrelevant in the long run. There have been papers by the people who've studied Degarelix. Peter Albertson wrote a very nice retrospective meta-analysis, which essentially looked at the differences of cardiovascular toxicity in about 7 different Degarelix trials versus LHRH studies. And there was very nicely reported in the European Urology paper that there was a difference, a clinically significant difference in the incidence of cardiovascular events. And then most recently, Margell did a phase 2 study of about 80 patients in prospectively looking at Degarelix versus LHRH agonists, and their findings virtually mirrored our findings of the HERO trial, that cardiovascular events, specifically major adverse cardiovascular events, were more pronounced in their study as well as in ours, which was a global phase 3 trial. The cardiovascular events are more pronounced for patients receiving an agonist over an antagonist. And I think it's fair to say in most of the world, our elderly male population clearly has a high risk of cardiovascular comorbidities. So I think those are a lot of the reasons why the agonist market has continued to maintain a stronghold, and a lot of the reasons why Degarelix never achieved greater adoption.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just curious that in your daily clinical practice, how many percentage of patients you will prescribe Degarelix in your daily clinical work versus LHRH agonists for the patients, for your patients? Actually.
Yes, and that's a very fair question. For my clinic and my practice, I have used and continue to use Degarelix almost exclusively when I initiate therapy. And I continue patients on Degarelix almost exclusively unless it becomes, I have 2 issues which will change my conversion from Degarelix currently, as we speak, to an LHRH agonist. And it is injection site discomfort or convenience. If a patient lives far away and it just becomes difficult for the patient to come to the clinic monthly. But I've always been a believer that the cardiovascular benefit and the reduction of cardiovascular toxicity outweighed that inconvenience. But I do share that with my patients, and I think it's a fair consideration for patients to then make that decision.
Okay, okay, I agree, thank you. And also, after the successful treatment with oral Relugolix right now, so what do you think will be the next step in prostate cancer treatment? I mean, for the oral Relugolix clinical trials. For example, I just thought about it because in prostate cancer, we know in adjuvant therapy after the surgery, the ADT actually is only useful for the lymph node positive patients, right? It's not very useful for the lymph node negative patients. One point I think is possible because the potency of the LHRH agonist is not potent enough. Would you think it's possible to try oral Relugolix in the future for the adjuvant therapy of prostate cancer for the lymph node negative patients? Is that possible?
Well, I think that, being able to take a daily 1 pill dosing schedule, 1 pill once a day, is exceptionally convenient for patients. And in our HERO trial, we demonstrated 2 things that I think are important that may have implications regarding additional trials, as well as approved indications for testosterone suppression adjuvant therapy. The convenience of 1 pill once a day, the rapidity of the T suppression, and the profound degree of the T suppression, if we define testosterone levels of less than 20 as profound. And I think it's fair to say that many guidelines are adopting that definition. But what we saw in our study was, in comparison to Leuprorelin, the sustained T suppression over a 48-week period not only met the non-inferiority endpoint, but also met the superiority from a statistical analysis, but so achieved greater suppression. And then in a subset of about 184 patients who stopped both therapies, the recovery of testosterone in the daily oral Relugolix was achieved in 54% versus only 3% of the Leuprorelin arm at 3 months. That finding is very relevant for well-known, non-controversial adjuvant treatments of T suppression, specifically for our patients with intermediate high-risk disease who have radiation therapy. Because as we all know, that patients really look forward to their recovery of their testosterone. They will feel markedly better. Their quality of life clearly is maintained when they get T recovery. As it relates to additional trials, I think it's a very exciting time, whether the patients have high-risk features post-prostatectomy for margin positivity. Can a adjuvant strategy encompassing testosterone suppression with a more rapid suppression and more rapid recovery be aligned potentially with other oral medications, for example, the AR pathway inhibitors, such as apalutamide, enzalutamide, darolutamide, for those patients at high risk for recurrence post-prostatectomy or post-radiation, who may not, or depending upon the form of their radiation, maybe they're receiving adjuvant radiation post-prostatectomy. And we debate how long and when to augment those adjuvant or salvage radiation patients with testosterone suppression. Using a formulation of a daily pill with rapid suppression and rapid recovery, I think is very exciting for future clinical trials. And we actually have our steering committee members, we're getting together very soon to look at a lot of different industry-sponsored studies versus investigator-initiated sponsored studies because of these additional advantages of the once daily oral relugolix as well as its mechanism of action.
Okay, thanks very much. So I also have a question that in our daily clinical practice, actually a few patients, a minority of the patients still cannot get the castrate level low enough, right? Still, even with oral relugolix, it's not 100% for the patients having the testosterone level very low, right? In this case, if the patients cannot have the castrate level of testosterone, what do you think we should do for these patients additionally?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because you're right. Even with bilateral orchiectomy, we don't always achieve adequate castration of less than 50 nanogram per deciliter, and oftentimes not even below the 20, which I'm a proponent of getting it below 20 if at all possible. The various explanations for this include extragonadal sources of androgen production, which I think is the most likely reason, probably emanating from adrenal production. In patients who have metastatic disease, it's certainly also possible it comes from tumoral sources of androgen production. And a third possibility is mutations at the level of the anterior pituitary receptors where the agonist and antagonist effects are occurring. A fourth explanation when it comes to exogenous medication, whether it's a pill or a parenteral IM sub-Q, is a deficit in administration or compliance by the patients, or a deficit in mixing and formulation within the clinic, or potentially absorption upon deposition. So I think these 4 or 5 different issues are the factors that go through my thinking when I have a patient who's not achieving adequate testosterone suppression.
Okay, okay, thanks very much. So I know you are a surgeon, right? You are a surgeon. Yes, yeah. So I'm curious that in your center or in the medical system in United States, how medical oncologists can collaborate with the surgeons for the GU cancer treatment, for example, the prostate cancer treatment. I'm a medical oncologist from Shanghai Cancer Center, so we have a very well multidisciplinary team here for the GU cancer. So I'm the only medical oncologist in this team. Most of them are surgeons. So I'm wondering what's the pattern in your center, or what's your opinion about this?
Well, first and foremost, I think that the urologic surgeons in Shanghai are very, very lucky and fortunate to have you because your expertise allows for optimization of patient care. And I have always felt that the multidisciplinary team approach, especially given the complexity of advanced prostate cancer, honestly, all of GU cancers, which is where I've spent the last 2 decades of my career, but as you know, throughout all of medical oncology, advanced malignancies, the advances in biomarkers, the advances in genomics and molecular characterizations and various different druggable targets, and advanced prostate cancer is no exception. It's become increasingly more complex.
Yes.
And unfortunately, a real benefit, therefore, to patient care. And a multidisciplinary team with expertise and specialization of medical oncology, urology, radiation oncology, nuclear medicine, radiology, pathology, the nurse component. These are pivotal to making sure that our patients get the best care. And, you know, frankly, I've always championed the concept that I don't really care what someone's specialty training is, as long as he or she is dedicated to the knowledge and continued educational advances that are happening. And they're happening at a really tremendous speed, which has been very enjoyable, I'm sure, for you and for me as scientists and clinicians. So embracing collaboration and sharing of knowledge is the only way we continue to make sure that all of our patients get the best care they can possibly choose from.
Okay, thanks very much. I agree. So just out of curiosity, so we know that Sipuleucel-T, the Provenge vaccine actually has been approved and also used in the United States, but not in the other parts of the world. So is that still a standard treatment for your patients in the United States right now? It's not, I don't think it's widely used right now, right?
I had the good fortune to be one of the largest accruing trial sites back in 2002 for the Sipuleucel-T trials.
Okay.
And I had the privilege to be the third author of the New England Journal paper that led to its approval in the United States. Phil Kantoff is the first author. Sipuleucel-T is widely used in urology practices and medical oncology practices in the US, in community and academia. The advantages of it and why it's part of the NCCN guidelines and as well as the AUA guidelines for CRPC.
Yes.
And as to your point, it's only approved in the US. It's given over a 6-week period. It's 3 infusions. The safety profile has been well established. And there's a survival benefit, and it does not preclude any other treatments. So it initially, when it was developed, I think that there was some pushback regarding concerns about the cost. But as you and I both know, the cost of oncolytic therapies is very high, unfortunately, throughout the world, typically worse in the United States. But the cost of these other therapies has caught up to the cost of Sipuleucel-T. I think that there's some recent data on Sipuleucel-T that in certain populations, particularly Black populations, that they do remarkably better than non-Black populations. There's some additional studies that we're looking at it in combination with other approved treatments. A recent phase 2 study was markedly compelling when done from Johns Hopkins when combining it with radium-223. Very interestingly, I think, as you may know, that the company was purchased by SanPower, which is in China. And I think that that's great. And I'm very hopeful that the leadership will continue to develop the role for Sipuleucel-T outside of the United States. Sipuleucel-T was the first immunotherapy approved in all of cancer care that had a survival benefit, not just in prostate cancer, but in all of systemic cancer care. And look what's happened in the last few years with checkpoint inhibitors, which have just completely revolutionized so many aspects of systemic therapy. The PDL and PD receptor blockers. And so I think oftentimes our younger colleagues forget that Sipuleucel-T really helped lead that pathway of immunotherapy. We recently completed a phase 3 study looking at Sipuleucel-T in an enriched active surveillance population of newly diagnosed localized prostate cancer. We enrolled 500 patients in less than 12 months, comparing active surveillance to patients receiving a Sipuleucel T. It's called the PROVENT trial.
Okay.
So I'm very excited and happy to know that SunPower, and I'm hearing great potential that they will expand the access of Sipuleucel T outside of the United States, which I think would be very good for patient care.
Okay. So one thing is that the difference between Sipuleucel T and PD-1, okay, the immune checkpoint inhibitor, is that for Sipuleucel T, actually you don't see substantial response among the cancer patients. So you only see the survival benefit, right? But you don't see good or convincing response from the patients. But for PD-1, you maybe only 20% or 25% of patients will have a response, but still you see the response, and then you see the long time survival benefit. So I think that's a big difference, which because if the survival benefit is just a few months, right, for some patients, it's hard to persuade the patients or the other treating physicians to believe that, I guess, not from the overall results of the clinical trial. I mean, to treat for the patients individually, right? We treat the patients individually, right? So that's the big question between them. So so I think my questions are most about that. So I still think the HERO trial you led actually is very surprising and very convincing and interesting, because at first you designed it as a non-inferiority study. You just try to demonstrate that it has a similar efficacy, right, compared with the control. But then you found that not only non-inferiority, it's actually superior to the control drug, and not only in efficacy, but also in safety and almost any secondary endpoint. This study is tremendously unbelievable. It's hard to find in the literature. It's very interesting. So thank you very much. You did a great job for the patients, right? For the world, actually.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks. I think it's an honor to talk with you, and my questions have been all answered. So I enjoy your paper, your study, and your contribution. So thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. See you.